Wyoming Territory, 1873. The dust of Redemption Gulch was a living thing. It rose from a single, wide street with the passage of every horse and wagon, a fine, golden powder that settled on everything, coating hat brims and window panes with a film of the untamed land. It swirled like golden phantoms in the shafts of late afternoon sun that slanted between the saloon and the general store, a constant, silent testament to the vast, dry emptiness that surrounded the small collection of buildings. For Elias Thorne, that dust was as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands or the quiet ache that lived behind his ribs. He sat on the bench outside the mercantile, his back against the rough-hewn timber, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon where the jagged peaks of the Tetons tore at the pale blue sky. He was a man carved from the same hard materials as the land itself. At 32, his face was already a map of sun and wind, with lines etched at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the distance. His broad shoulders were set in a way that spoke of labor, not leisure, and his hands, resting on his denim-clad knees, were blunt and capable. He had come to this place seeking silence, and he had found it. The silence was in the whisper of the wind through the sparse pines that dotted the hills beyond his ranch, in the vast, star-drenched emptiness of the night sky, and most of all, in the hollow chambers of his own heart. He had built his world on a foundation of solitude, believing attachment was a weakness, a door left unlocked for grief to enter. He had learned that lesson once, learned it so thoroughly that the memory was branded onto his soul. His weekly trip to town was a necessity, a brief and grudging concession to the world of men. He traded cured hides for flour, salt, and coffee, collected his mail, which was never anything more than a month-old newspaper from Cheyenne, and then retreated back to the ordered isolation of his ranch. Today, however, a change was coming on the wind. He heard it before he saw it, a distant, mournful whistle that cut through the sleepy afternoon air. The weekly stagecoach from the east. Its arrival was the town's main event, a brief connection to the world they had all left behind for one reason or another. For Elias, it was usually just a nuisance, stirring up more dust and filling the saloon with loud talk. He watched the cloud of dust on the horizon grow, resolving itself into the familiar shape of the Concord coach, pulled by a team of 6 weary horses. It lumbered down the main street, the jangle of its harness and the creak of its leather suspension a symphony of arrival. It pulled to a halt in front of the Wells Fargo office, the driver's gruff commands to the horses echoing in the sudden quiet. A few townspeople drifted out of doorways to watch. The station master, a portly man named Henderson with a perpetually sweating brow, came out to unlatch the door. Elias had no interest in the passengers. They were usually land speculators in cheap suits or hopeful miners with more dreams than sense, none of whom ever lasted more than a season. He was about to push himself to his feet and head for his wagon when the coach door swung open and a woman stepped out. She was the first to emerge, and the sight of her made him pause, his hand frozen midway to his knee. She was like a creature from another world. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, a deep cornflower blue, though it was travel-worn and dusted with the grime of the trail. A matching hat, adorned with a ribbon that had likely once been crisp, was pinned to a knot of hair the color of spun honey. She moved with a delicate grace that was entirely out of place in the gritty reality of Redemption Gulch, her hand resting for a moment on the doorframe as she surveyed her new surroundings. He saw her gaze sweep over the dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, the curious faces of the onlookers. He could see the fatigue in the set of her shoulders, but beneath it, there was a steel spine of determination. Her chin was lifted, her eyes, even from this distance, he could tell they were a startling shade of green, like moss in a shaded creek, were searching, hopeful. She was looking for someone. Elias felt a familiar, unwelcome stirring of something he had long since buried. It was not desire, not exactly. It was a primal protective instinct, the kind a man feels when he sees something fine and breakable in a place of rock and thorns. He immediately crushed it. It was not his concern. He had his own world to manage, a world with no room for fragile things from the east. More passengers disembarked, grumbling about the journey, but the woman in blue remained by the coach, her hands now clutching a small reticule. Her hopeful expression began to curdle into uncertainty, then into a quiet, dignified panic. The man she was waiting for was not there. Elias knew the signs. He had seen them before. The station master was talking to her now, gesturing with his hands. The coach driver was unloading her trunk, a large, handsome piece of luggage that looked as out of place as she did. It was dropped onto the boardwalk with a heavy thud that seemed to startle her. Elias watched as the other passengers collected their belongings and dispersed, melting into the saloon or the hotel. Soon, she was alone on the boardwalk with the station master, who was shrugging his shoulders with an air of finality. He pointed a thumb towards the saloon. Silas Blackwood? Fellas in their most days, ma'am. Or he was, the man's voice carried on the still air. Ain't seen him in near a week. He then tipped his hat and retreated into his office, leaving her standing beside her trunk, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the harsh frontier. She stood there for a long moment, motionless. The sun beat down, and the dust swirled around the hem of her blue dress. Elias could see the subtle trembling of her hands. Two rough-looking men who had been loitering outside the saloon took notice of her. They exchanged a look, their leering grins communicating a silent, ugly conversation. They started to saunter towards her, their spurs ringing on the wooden planks. That was it. Elias couldn't explain the force that propelled him to his feet. It was an instinct older than reason. He had built walls around his heart to keep the world out, but he had not forsaken the basic tenets of decency. A lone woman, stranded and vulnerable, was not a sight he could ignore. He crossed the street in a dozen long strides, his boots making solid, purposeful sounds that cut through the men's careless swagger. They saw him coming and hesitated. Elias Thorne was not a man to be trifled with. His reputation for quiet competence and a dangerous lack of patience was well known in Redemption Gulch. He didn't even look at them. He fixed his gaze on her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You seem to be in some trouble," she startled, her head snapping up. Her eyes were even greener up close, wide and filled with a mixture of fear and pride. I was supposed to be met. A Mr. Silas Blackwood." Her voice was cultured, crisp, every syllable a testament to a life lived 1,000 miles and a world away from this place. "Blackwood's gone," Elias said, his tone flat, stating a fact, not offering an opinion. "Cleared out last week. Left a string of debts behind him." He saw the last vestiges of hope drain from her face, leaving behind a stark, pale vulnerability. Her composure, so carefully maintained, began to shatter like glass against stone. Her shoulders slumped, and for a second, he thought she might collapse right there on the boardwalk. "Oh," she whispered, the word a small, broken thing. She swayed slightly. Elias instinctively reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm to steady her. The fabric of her sleeve was fine beneath his rough fingers, and through it, he could feel the tremor that ran through her. The contact was like a jolt of lightning. It was the first time he had willingly touched another person in a gentle way in years. The brief, accidental intimacy of the moment was a shock to his system. He felt the warmth of her, the fragile strength in her arm. He could smell a faint scent of lavender, a clean, sweet fragrance lost in the town's miasma of dust and whiskey. She pulled back as if burned, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you, Mr." she began, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength. "Thorne." Elias Thorne. He dropped his hand, feeling the sudden absence of her warmth. The two men from the saloon, seeing that she was no longer unattended, scowled and retreated back into the shadows of the doorway. "You have somewhere to stay?" he asked, his tone more gruff than he intended, a defense against the strange current that had passed between them. She shook her head, her gaze falling to the dusty toes of her wholly impractical leather boots. "No, I used all my fund for the passage. Mr. Blackwood was to provide for my lodging." The admission was clearly humiliating for her, and he admired the way she said it without a hint of a plea in her voice. She was stating her circumstances, not begging for his charity. Elias let out a slow breath, his mind racing. The hotel was no place for a woman alone, not with her looks and her predicament. The proprietor was a grasping man who would turn a blind eye to any trouble if the price was right. There was only one decent, honorable solution, and he hated it. He hated the complication, the intrusion, the crack it would make in the careful edifice of his solitude. He glanced towards a sheriff's office, where a light now burned. Sheriff Brody was a good man, and his wife, Martha, was the heart of the small community. "My name is Annalise Croft," she said softly, as if to remind him she was a person, not just a problem. "From Boston. Boston is a long way from here, Miss Croft," he said, his gaze sweeping over her again. She was not built for this land. She was all soft curves and refined edges, a porcelain doll in a blacksmith shop. And yet, there was that look in her eyes again, a flicker of unyielding spirit. "Come with me," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He bent down, and before she could protest, he lifted her heavy trunk with an ease that made her eyes widen. "We'll talk to the sheriff. He'll know what to do." He started walking, not looking back to see if she was following. He knew she would. At that moment, she had no other choice. And as he walked, the weight of her trunk in his hand felt like the weight of a world he had tried so hard to leave behind, a world of connection and complication that had just stepped off the stagecoach and into his life. Sheriff Brody's office was a small, cramped room that smelled of stale coffee, oiled leather, and the law. Brody himself was a man whose gentle demeanor belied a core of iron. He was thinning on top, with a kind, weathered face and hands that were surprisingly delicate for a man in his line of work. He listened intently as Annalise, her voice low but steady, explained her situation. Elias stood by the door, his arms crossed, feeling like a caged bear. He wanted to be on his horse, riding back to the familiar quiet of his ranch, not standing in this stuffy office with the scent of lavender clinging to his senses. When she finished, Brody sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Silas Blackwood. I should have known. He had the smell of a grifter about him from the day he arrived. Talked a big game about land investments and railroad spurs." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Miss Croft. He's wanted for fraud in 2 territories." He lit out when he heard a federal marshal was asking after him. Annalise absorbed the news with a quiet dignity that pricked at Elias's conscience. She simply nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I see. I was misled. You were swindled, is what you were," Brody said gently. "The question is what to do now." He looked from Annalise's pale face to Elias's stony one. An idea began to dawn in the sheriff's eyes, an idea Elias recognized and immediately wanted to extinguish. "The hotel is out of the question," Elias stated, his voice flat. He felt compelled to say it, to prevent the sheriff from even suggesting it. "My thoughts exactly," Brody agreed, stroking his chin. "And there aren't many families in town who could take you in, Miss Croft. Not on short notice." He paused, his gaze settling on Elias. "But Elias here, he has a fine, sturdy house. And plenty of room." Elias stiffened. "Sheriff," he began, a warning in his tone. "Now, hold on, Elias," Brody said, raising a hand. "I know you value your privacy, but my Martha could ride out with you. She could stay on for a few days, act as a proper chaperone. Give Miss Croft a safe place to rest her head while we figure out what's to be done. Maybe find her some respectable work." The idea was preposterous. A woman, a stranger, in his house. His house was a fortress, a sanctuary of memory and silence. It was the one place on earth that was entirely his, ordered precisely to his liking. Every chair and plate a silent monument to the life that had been extinguished within its walls. The thought of her presence there, her voice, her scent, her very being, felt like a violation. He looked at Annalise. She was staring at her hands, her face a mask of polite neutrality, but he could see the faint blush rising on her neck. She was mortified by the position she was in, forced to be the subject of such a debate. And in that moment, his own selfishness felt coarse and ugly. What was the violation of his peace compared to the very real danger she faced? He thought of the men outside the saloon, of the unforgiving wilderness that began at the edge of town. His solitude was a choice. Her vulnerability was not. The silence stretched. Brody waited, his expression patient. Annalise did not look up. The decision rested with Elias, and the weight of it was unexpectedly heavy. He thought of his wife, Sarah. What would she have done? The answer was immediate and clear. Sarah would have opened their home without a second thought, her heart moved by compassion, not by the selfish guarding of her own peace. The memory was a sharp, painful jab. Fine, Elias grunted, the word torn from him. She can stay, but only until the next stage passes through. A week. No more. He looked directly at Annalise. Martha's presence would be appropriate. Relief washed over Sheriff Brody's face. Excellent. I'll go fetch her. She's just finishing up at the church. He stood and grabbed his hat. Elias, you could take Miss Croft's trunk over to your wagon. We'll meet you there. He bustled out of the office, leaving them alone. The ensuing silence was thick with unspoken things. Annalise finally raised her eyes to meet his. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice formal. You have my profound gratitude. I am aware this is a great imposition. I promise I will be no trouble, and I will find a way to repay your kindness. Don't need repayment, he muttered, turning towards the door. Just need you to be ready to leave when the time comes. His words were a shield, meant to keep her at a distance, to remind them both that this was a temporary arrangement born of necessity, not choice. But as he stepped out into the fading light to retrieve her trunk, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just opened a door he had sworn to keep bolted forever. The ride to the ranch was conducted in near silence. Martha Brody, a round, cheerful woman with eyes that missed nothing, kept up a steady stream of one-sided conversation, pointing out landmarks and commenting on the weather. Annalise sat beside her on the wagon seat, offering polite but brief responses. Elias drove the team, his focus seemingly on the trail ahead, but his senses were acutely aware of the woman sitting just a few feet away. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the tight control she was exerting over her emotions. His ranch was nestled in a small, protected valley, a good hour's ride from town. A sturdy log house stood beside a creek that gurgled with clear, cold water, surrounded by a handful of outbuildings, a barn, a smithy, a chicken coop. It was a place of stark, functional beauty, built to withstand the elements, not to charm the eye. As they pulled into the yard, the last rays of the sun painted the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. My goodness, Elias, Martha said, looking around. You've kept the place up well. It's a fine homestead. Elias just grunted in response, pulling the horses to a halt. He jumped down and came around to help the women. When he reached for Annalise's hand, his callous palm engulfed her smaller, gloved one. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent another one of those unwelcome jolts through him. He ignored it, turning to unhitch the team. Inside, the house was just as he had left it, clean, sparse, and silent. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, which served as a kitchen, dining area, and living space. A long table with 2 benches stood in the center. A few shelves holding tin plates and a small collection of books lined one wall. It was a man's space, devoid of any soft touches. He saw Annalise's gaze drift over the room, taking in the Spartan furnishings, the rifle mounted over the mantelpiece, the stark lack of decoration. He wondered what she saw, a home or a shelter. Well, this is lovely and sturdy, Martha declared, untying her bonnet. Annalise, dear, you can have a loft room. It's small, but it's private. Elias, you can show her up while I get a fire started and see about some supper. I brought a stew. Martha was a whirlwind of practical energy, immediately transforming the quiet house into a place of bustling domesticity. Elias gestured stiffly towards a steep ladder-like staircase in the corner. Up there, he carried her trunk to the base of the stairs, knowing it was too heavy for her to manage. With a sigh of resignation, he heaved it onto his shoulder and began to climb. The loft was a small, wedge-shaped space under the eaves, containing a simple rope bed with a straw-tick mattress and a small, 3-legged stool. A single, small window looked out over the valley. He set the trunk down with a thud that shook the floorboards. The air was thick with the scent of dried pine and old memories. This had been a storage space, but before that, it had been meant for a child. A crib would have stood right where her trunk now sat. The thought ambushed him, a sudden, brutal blow to the chest that stole his breath. He had not been up here in years. He turned to leave, his face a grim mask. Annalise was standing at the top of the stairs, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said quietly. This is more than I could have hoped for." He didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded curtly and descended the stairs, leaving her alone in the space that held the ghost of his dead dreams. Downstairs, the smell of Martha's stew was beginning to fill the room, a warm, savory scent that was at odds with the cold knot in his stomach. He had let a stranger into his house, and she had, in the space of a few hours, already trespassed into the most sacred and painful corners of his memory. Dinner was a quiet affair. Elias ate quickly, his gaze fixed on his plate. Martha did her best to fill the silence, talking about town gossip and the price of eggs, while Annalise ate with a delicate precision that seemed out of place at the rough-hewn table. After the meal, Martha shooed Elias out of the way while she and Annalise cleared the plates. He retreated to the small porch, leaning against a post and staring out into the deepening twilight. The familiar chorus of crickets and the whisper of the wind in the pines did little to soothe the turmoil inside him. He could hear the low murmur of the women's voices from inside, the soft clatter of dishes. It was a sound his house had not known for a very long time. It was the sound of life, and it hurt more than the silence ever had. Later, as the full dark settled over the valley, they gathered around the hearth. Martha had taken up some knitting, her needles clicking in a steady, comforting rhythm. Elias sat in his usual chair, cleaning a rifle, the familiar, mechanical task of balm to his frayed nerves. Annalise sat on a stool on the other side of the fire, her hands idle in her lap. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the lines of fatigue and illuminating the thoughtful, serious expression in her eyes. "Miss Croft," Martha said, her voice gentle, "if you don't mind my asking, what made you decide to come all this way? To marry a man you'd never met?" Elias kept his eyes on his work, but he was listening. He wanted to know. He wanted to understand the series of events that had delivered this impossible woman to his doorstep. Annalise hesitated for a moment, her gaze on the dancing flames. "My parents passed away last winter," she said, her voice clear and without self-pity. "The influenza. It left me alone. Our home had to be sold to cover their debts. I had an education, but few practical skills that are valued for a woman seeking employment beyond that of a governess. A position I found untenable." She took a breath. Mr. Blackwood's advertisement in the newspaper promised a partnership, a chance to build a new life in a new land. He wrote eloquently of his prospects, of his desire for a respectable wife to make a home with. It seemed a logical solution, a path to a future where I would not be a burden to anyone. Her story was simple, tragic, and all too common. Elias felt a reluctant flicker of empathy. He understood loss. He understood the desperation that drove people to gamble on an unknown future. "You were very brave to make such a journey alone," Martha said softly. "I do not feel brave," Annalise replied, a wry, sad smile touching her lips. "I feel foolish. You were deceived," Elias said, his voice startling them both. He hadn't meant to speak. He looked up from the rifle, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. "That's not the same as being a fool." A flicker of surprise, then gratitude, warmed her expression. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." The moment stretched, charged with a new understanding. He had offered her a small piece of validation, and it had felt like handing over a part of himself. He saw something in her then, beyond the fine clothes and the refined manners. He saw the core of strength that had brought her across a continent, the resilience that kept her from weeping in despair. He looked back down at his rifle, his knuckles white. He was beginning to respect her, and that was far more dangerous than simply pitying her. Later, Martha went to the small guest room off the main living area, and Annalise ascended to the loft. Elias was left alone with the dying fire. He banked the embers for the night, the familiar ritual feeling different, charged with the lingering presence of his guests. He spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth, as he always did. But sleep did not come easily. The house felt different. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a home again, if only for a night. And in the darkness, he was forced to admit a terrifying truth. The silence he had so carefully cultivated for 3 years had not been peace. It had just been emptiness. The next few days fell into a strange, new rhythm. Martha, bless her soul, was a force of nature. She organized the larder, mended Elias's worn shirts, and filled the house with the smells of baking bread. She drew Annalise into her orbit, teaching her the practical skills of frontier life. Elias watched from a distance as Annalise learned to knead dough, her brow furrowed in concentration, a dusting of flour on her cheek. He saw her feed the chickens, flinching at first when they pecked at the grain in her hand, then laughing, a sound as clear and unexpected as a spring thaw. She was a quick study. She did not complain about the hard work, the lack of amenities, or the general roughness of her new reality. Instead, she approached each task with a quiet determination that continued to chip away at his preconceived notions of her. She was not the fragile porcelain doll he had first imagined. There was a strength in her, a surprising adaptability that he found himself admiring more each day. He would catch himself watching her as she hung laundry on the line, the wind whipping strands of her honey-colored hair across her face, or as she sat on the porch in the evening, reading one of the few books he owned, her face rapt with concentration. He kept his distance, speaking to her only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. He spent his days out on the range, mending fences and checking on his small herd of cattle, seeking the familiar comfort of hard labor and wide-open spaces. But her image followed him. He would find himself thinking of the way her eyes lit up when she saw a hawk circling overhead, or the serious set of her mouth as she learned to properly pluck a chicken under Martha's tutelage. He was an observer in his own home, a stranger to the life that was unfolding within its walls. One evening, after Martha had gone to bed, he found Annalise sitting by the fire, her hands empty, her gaze lost in the flames. The usual polite conversation had died away, leaving a silence that felt different from the ones he was used to. It was not empty. It was filled with unspoken questions. "You should not have had to come here," he said, breaking the quiet. The words were an apology, an acknowledgement of the injustice of her situation. She looked up, her expression soft in the firelight. "Perhaps not. But now that I am here, I find it is not what I expected. It's a hard land," he said. "It takes more than it gives. It is also beautiful," she countered, her voice gentle but firm. "I have never seen a sky so large. Back home, the sky was something you saw in small patches between buildings. Here it is everything. The quiet, it is not empty. It is full of sounds I'm only just beginning to learn." Her words were a direct challenge to his own bitter philosophy. She saw beauty where he saw hardship, fullness where he saw absence. He found himself wanting to argue, to warn her, to protect her from the inevitable heartbreak this land would deliver. But he also found himself wanting to see it through her eyes. "You lost someone," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Here, in this house, the words hit him like a physical blow. He froze, his hand tightening around the mug of coffee he held. No one had spoken of it so directly in years. The townspeople knew, of course, but they gave his grief a wide, respectful berth. They did not name it. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice raw. "I see it in you," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And in the house, there's a space here that was once filled. A woman's touch is gone, but the ghost of it remains. In the way a shelf is hung, in the hook by the door where a bonnet might have rested," she paused. "I know what that kind of loss feels like. The world continues on, but your own world has stopped turning. It creates a silence that only those who have lived inside it can recognize." He stared at her, his defenses crumbling. She was not just seeing his grief, she was reflecting her own. She was offering him not pity, but a profound and terrifying understanding. In that moment, they were not a gruff rancher and a stranded lady from the East. They were two survivors, Two souls marked by loss, sitting together in the quiet dark. He found himself speaking, the words coming out in a torrent he was powerless to stop. Her name was Sarah, he said, the name in agony on his tongue. My wife. And we had a son, Luke. He was only 4 inch. He looked into the fire, but he saw their faces. Sarah's bright smile, Luke's wild black hair. The fever took them both. In the winter, 3 years ago, they died in the bed upstairs. The one Martha is sleeping in, the confession left him hollowed out, exposed. He had not spoken their names aloud to another living soul since he had buried them on the hill behind the house. He waited for her to offer platitudes, to say she was sorry, to offer the empty words people used when faced with a grief too large to comprehend. But Annalise did not. She simply watched him, her eyes luminous with unshed tears. Thank you for telling me their names, she whispered. It was the perfect thing to say. She was not mourning his loss. She was honoring their lives. She was acknowledging that they had been real, that they had filled the space he now guarded so fiercely. A single tear escaped his control, tracing a hot path through the grime on his cheek. He wiped it away angrily with the back of his hand. He felt a profound sense of shame at his own vulnerability, but beneath it, there was something else, a small, fragile seed of relief. The burden of his silence, a weight he had carried for so long, had been lifted just for a moment. He had shared his past, and the world had not ended. The house still stood, the fire still burned, and the woman across from him was looking at him not with pity, but with a deep, resonant empathy that reached across the space between them and touched the frozen core of his heart. The fragile truce born of their shared vulnerability was shattered 2 days later. Martha had returned to town, promising to come back in a few days and to ask around about any suitable positions for Annalise. Her departure left a palpable void in the house, a return to a quiet that now felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Elias and Annalise moved around each other with a new, careful awareness. The chasm between them had been bridged by her understanding, but now they were left standing on opposite sides of a new, more intimate divide. Elias was repairing a harness on the porch when he saw the riders. There were 2 of them, coming down the valley at a confident pace. They were not neighbors. Their clothes were too new, their saddles too ornate for working cowhands. They rode with an arrogant slouch that set his teeth on edge. He laid his tools aside, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. He stood up as they reined in their horses in his yard, kicking up dust that settled on Annalise's small, fledgling herb garden near the porch steps. That's far enough, Elias said, his voice level and cold. The lead rider, a burly man with a florid face and a handlebar mustache, smirked. We're just looking for a man. Name of Silas Blackwood. Heard he might have come this way. You heard wrong, Elias replied, his eyes narrowed. He's long gone, the second man, leaner and with shifty, rat-like eyes, let his gaze drift past Elias to the open doorway of the house, where Annalise had appeared, her face pale. Maybe he is, the rat-faced man said, his voice a greasy whine. But he left something behind. A lady friend. From back east, his eyes raked over Annalise, insolent and appraising. Elias took a half-step forward, placing himself more squarely between them and the door. The lady is under my protection. She has nothing to do with Blackwood or his affairs. Now, I suggest you ride on. The florid man chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. Our employer, Mr. Corbin, seems to think otherwise. He thinks Blackwood didn't leave empty-handed, and that his pretty little fiancée might know where he, or what he took, ended up. We've been authorized to be very persuasive in our inquiries. The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. This is my land, Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. And that is my house. You are not welcome here. I won't tell you again. The 2 men exchanged a look. They saw the unyielding set of his jaw, the way his hand hovered over his gun. They were bullies and hired muscle, not hardened gunmen looking for a fair fight. For now, they were content to deliver their message. Mr. Corbin is a patient man, but his patience has limits, the first man said. He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture towards Annalise. "Mom, we'll be seeing you again." He wheeled his horse around, and the two of them trotted out of the yard, leaving a trail of dust and menace behind them. Elias stood motionless until they were out of sight, his body coiled like a spring. He could feel Annalise's frightened gaze on his back. He turned slowly to face her. "Get inside," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. She flinched but held her ground. "Who are they? What do they want?" "Trouble," he said grimly. "It seems your Mr. Blackwood was more than just a swindler. He was a thief, and he stole from the wrong people." He strode past her into the house, grabbing his rifle from its rack over the mantel. He began checking the action, his movements swift and sure. "What did he steal?" she asked, following him inside, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know. Land deeds, money, it doesn't matter. They think you know something. And men like Jedediah Corbin don't ask politely for long." He looked at her, his face a mask of grim resolve. He saw the fear in her eyes, and it ignited a cold fury inside him. These men had brought their filth to his doorstep, had threatened this woman he had reluctantly taken under his care. They had violated his sanctuary. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "You're going to stay inside and away from the windows. I am going to make sure they understand the meaning of the word unwelcome." He was already planning, his mind a whirl of defensive strategy. He would check the perimeter, bring the horses into the barn, bar the shutters. This house had been built to withstand blizzards and bandits. It would be tested tonight. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, and it was coming for them. For her. And as Elias moved through the familiar motions of preparing for a fight, he realized with a startling clarity that his actions were not just about defending his property. He was defending her. The thought did not frighten him as it would have a week ago. It settled in his chest with the solid, undeniable weight of truth. His solitude had been breached, but in its place, something far more powerful was taking root, a fierce, unwavering sense of purpose. The day bled into a tense, watchful evening. Elias did not bother to light the main lamps, leaving the house in a state of deepening twilight, illuminated only by the low fire in the hearth. He had moved a chair into the shadows near the front window, his rifle resting across his lap. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, was magnified in the charged silence. Annalise sat at the table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She had not spoken a word since he had explained the situation, her face a pale oval in the gloom. He felt the need to say something, to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. His language was action, not comfort. Instead, he found himself studying her, watching the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair. She was terrified, he knew, yet she sat with a stillness and composure that spoke of a deep inner strength. She was not weeping or hysterical. She was waiting just as he was. "This is my fault," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "They are here because of me. I have brought this danger to your home, Mr. Thorne. Their name is Corbin, not Thorne. The danger belongs to them," he replied, his gaze not leaving the dark yard outside the window. "And my name is Elias." The use of his given name was a small, unconscious offering of intimacy in the face of the shared threat. "Elias," she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. "You should not have to fight this battle for me. You are under my roof," he said, as if that explained everything. And in his world it did. It was a simple, unbreakable code. Protection was not a choice, it was an obligation. But even as he thought it, he knew it was more than that. The thought of those men putting their hands on her, of the fear he had seen in her eyes, stirred something in him that went far beyond duty. It was personal. The attack did not come that night. The darkness remained empty, the silence broken only by the cry of a distant coyote. The tension, however, did not dissipate. It coiled tighter with each passing hour. The next day, Elias insisted she stay inside while he did his chores, his rifle never far from his hand. The beautiful, empty land that had once been his refuge now felt fraught with menace. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. That afternoon, he decided they needed supplies. It was a risk to leave the ranch, an even greater risk to take her with him, but the thought of leaving her alone was unbearable. "We're riding to town," he announced. "We need more ammunition, and you will stay close to me. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide. He saddled his steady gelding, Titan, and a gentler mare for her. He watched as she mounted, her movements surprisingly confident. "I learned to ride at my cousin's estate in the country," she explained, seeing his look of surprise. It was another small revelation, another piece of her past that contradicted his initial assumptions. They rode through the woods, taking a less traveled path that offered more cover. The air was cool beneath the pines, the ground dappled with sunlight. For a moment, it was almost possible to forget the threat that shadowed them. Annalise seemed to relax in the saddle, her face losing some of its tension as she looked around at the natural beauty of the forest. They were halfway to town, riding through a narrow ravine, when the trap was sprung. The crack of a rifle echoed from the ridge above them, the bullet kicking up dirt just inches from Annalise's horse. The mare reared, screaming in terror. Annalise cried out, clinging desperately to the reins as the panicked animal bolted. "Annalise!" Elias roared, his heart lurching into his throat. He spurred Titan, the powerful gelding leaping forward in pursuit. Another shot rang out, this one closer. He drew his pistol, firing blindly towards the ridge to provide covering fire. He saw them then, the two men from the other day, scrambling down the rocks, trying to head her off. His world narrowed to a single, desperate objective: reach her. The mare was running wild, careening through the trees, a low-hanging branch threatening to sweep Annalise from the saddle. He pushed Titan harder, the horse responding with a surge of speed. He drew alongside the terrified mare, reaching out. "Give me the reins," he yelled. She was pale with fear, her hat gone, her hair flying wildly around her, but her eyes were fixed on his, trusting. She let go, and he grabbed the leather straps, pulling back with all his strength. The two horses jostled against each other as he fought to bring the mare under control. Finally, she slowed, her sides heaving, her eyes rolling with fear. Elias leaped from his saddle, pulling Annalise from hers. She stumbled into his arms, her body trembling uncontrollably. He held her tight, his one arm wrapped around her like a steel band, the other still holding his pistol, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of their attackers. He could feel her heart hammering against his chest, her breath coming in ragged sobs against his shoulder. He buried his face in her hair, the scent of lavender and pine filling his senses, a strange anchor in the chaos. "I've got you," he murmured, the words a rough promise against her temple. "You're safe. I've got you." He had rescued her. The raw, visceral terror of seeing her in danger, of almost losing her, had ripped away his last defenses. In that moment, holding her trembling form against his, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that his carefully constructed world of solitude was gone forever. He had fought to save her not out of obligation, but because the thought of a world without her in it was now, suddenly, and terrifyingly, impossible to imagine. The ride back to the ranch was a grim, silent affair. Elias kept Annalise on the mare, but held its reins himself, leading the horse as he rode Titan. His senses were on high alert, every shadow a potential enemy, every bird call a possible warning. The ambush had been clumsy, a failed attempt at abduction, but it was a clear escalation. Corbin's men were done with threats. When they reached the safety of the yard, he helped her down. Her legs were unsteady, and she leaned against him for a moment, her face buried in his shirt. He did not push her away. He let his hand rest on the small of her back, a small, solid gesture of reassurance. The fear had subsided, leaving behind a raw, shaken intimacy. Inside the house, the reality of their situation crashed down on him. He had brought her here to keep her safe, and in doing so, he had made her a target. His home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison, a fortress under siege. The responsibility for her life rested squarely on his shoulders, and the weight of it was immense. His old creed, that attachment was a weakness, came back to him with a vengeance. His growing feelings for her, The protective instinct that was now a roaring fire in his gut had put her in more danger, not less. He began to pace the room, his mind a battlefield. He had to get her away. Away from him, away from this ranch, away from Corbin and his thugs. The only logical solution was to send her back east, back to a world where she would be safe. The thought was like a knife in his gut, but he clung to it as the only honorable course of action. He had to protect her, even if it meant protecting her from the consequences of being with him. He turned to face her. She was sitting by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him with those wide, green eyes. "The stage leaves in 2 days," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He was building his walls back up, brick by painful brick. "I'm taking you to town tomorrow. You'll stay with the Brodus until it departs. I'll give you the money for your passage back to Boston." He saw the hope in her eyes extinguish, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, then a deep, shimmering hurt. It was as if he had slapped her. "You're sending me away?" she whispered. "It's the only way to keep you safe," he said, his tone harsh. He had to be cruel to be kind. He had to make her want to leave. "This is not your fight. This is not your life. You don't belong here, Annalise. You never did." Each word was a deliberate blow, aimed at severing the fragile connection that had grown between them. He was pushing her away with all his might, using the very arguments he no longer believed himself. He saw her flinch, her chin coming up in that proud way she had. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I see," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I was beginning to think. I was mistaken. You are right, Mr. Thorne. I am in a position. I will be glad to be out of your way." She stood up, her back ramrod straight, and walked with a steady, dignified pace to the ladder leading to the loft. She did not look back. Elias stood alone in the center of the room, listening to her footsteps overhead. The silence that descended was heavier, more profound than any he had ever known. He had done the right thing, the honorable thing. He had protected her. So why did it feel as though he had just ripped out his own heart? He sank into a chair, the rifle feeling heavy and cold in his hands, the victory of his logic tasting like ash in his mouth. He had won the argument and lost everything that was beginning to matter. Night fell, bringing with it a suffocating darkness. Elias did not sleep. He sat by the window, a sentinel guarding a home that now felt utterly empty. He could hear no sound from the loft above, and the silence was an accusation. He replayed their conversation in his mind. The hurt in her eyes, a searing image, burned onto his memory. He had meant to protect her, but he had only wounded her, treating her as a fragile object to be shipped away, not as the strong, resilient woman he knew her to be. He had denied her agency, her courage, and in doing so, he had insulted the very qualities he had come to admire. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The wind picked up, moaning around the corners of the house like a restless spirit. It was in the deepest hour of the night, when the world was suspended between one day and the next, that he heard it. Not the wind, but a different sound. The soft, deliberate crunch of a boot on gravel. He was instantly alert, every muscle tensed. He peered into the darkness, his eyes straining. He saw a flicker of movement near the barn. Then another. They were here. Corbin's men, and they had come in force. He counted at least 4 shadows, moving with a sinister purpose towards the house. He moved without a sound, grabbing the spare rifle and a box of cartridges. He scrambled up the ladder to the loft. Annalise was awake, sitting bolt upright on her bed, her eyes wide with fear in the sliver of moonlight coming through the small window. "They're here," he whispered, his voice urgent. She didn't panic. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on his face. "Stay down," he commanded, pressing the rifle into her hands. "Do you know how to use this?" "My father taught me," she whispered back. He believed a woman should know how to defend herself. Another surprise. Another layer to the woman he thought he understood. "Good," he said, a grim satisfaction in his tone. "Don't fire unless they get inside. But if they do, don't hesitate." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the words he had said earlier felt like a bitter poison on his tongue. He had called her weak, told her she didn't belong. And here she was, ready to face down armed men with him, her fear eclipsed by a quiet, steely resolve. A crash of glass from downstairs shattered the night. They were breaking the windows. "Get down," he hissed, pulling her to the floor just as a gunshot erupted, the bullet splintering the wooden wall where she had been standing. The assault had begun. He left her in the relative safety of the loft and slid back down the ladder, moving into the main room. He could hear them now, circling the house, calling out taunts. "Thorne, send out the girl, and we'll leave you be." It was the florid-faced man's voice. "Go to hell," Elias roared back, firing a shot through the broken window that sent them scattering for cover. The house was plunged into a chaotic symphony of splintering wood, shouting, and gunfire. Elias moved from window to window, a phantom in the darkness, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He was outnumbered, but this was his ground. He knew every angle, every shadow. A heavy thud came from the back door as one of the men tried to batter it down. Elias raced to the kitchen area, bracing himself against the wall. The wood groaned, splintering around the lock. Just as the door was about to give way, a figure charged through the opening. Before Elias could fire, a shape descended from the loft ladder. Annalise. She swung a heavy iron skillet with all her might, catching the intruder squarely on the side of the head. He grunted in surprise and crumpled to the floor in a heap. Elias stared, dumbfounded for a split second. She stood over the unconscious man, the skillet held like a weapon, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a warrior. "I told you to stay up there," he yelled, a strange mixture of terror and fierce pride surging through him. "You needed help," she yelled back, her voice ringing with defiance. There was no time to argue. Another man was climbing through the front window. Elias spun and fired, the shot echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. The man cried out and fell back outside, but they were being overwhelmed. The back door was breached. The front window was open. He grabbed her arm, pulling her behind the heavy wooden table he had overturned for cover. Bullets tore through the room, ripping into the log walls. They were pinned down. He risked a glance over the top. Two men were advancing into the room, their pistols leveled. He fired, taking one down, but the other returned fire, the bullet grazing Elias's arm, a hot, searing pain. He gritted his teeth, reloading with fumbling fingers. This was it. They were going to be overrun. He looked at Annalise, crouched beside him, her face pale but resolute. He saw the trust in her eyes, the courage. And in that moment, faced with the very real possibility of their deaths, his foolish, prideful words from earlier, his entire philosophy of solitude, turned to dust. All that mattered was her. "Annalise," he said, his voice ragged, desperate. "I was wrong. I was a fool. Sending you away, it was the worst mistake of my life. I was trying to protect you, but I was just protecting myself from feeling anything." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking away a smudge of dirt. "I can't lose you. I love you." The declaration hung in the air between them, more powerful than the gunfire. Her eyes widened, tears springing forth, not of fear, but of a raw, overwhelming emotion. The world outside the small space of their shelter ceased to exist. "Elias," she breathed, her hand coming up to cover his. The moment was broken by a shout from outside, followed by a fresh volley of gunfire, but this time it was not directed at the house. It was coming from the direction of the road. The sheriff, Brody, and a posse. The sounds of the fight shifted, turning into a rout as Corbin's men, caught between two forces, tried to flee. Elias and Annalise stayed behind their barricade, listening as the chaos subsided, replaced by Sheriff Brody's authoritative shouts. It was over. They were safe. In the sudden, ringing silence of the house, they looked at each other. The confession, spoken in the heat of battle, now settled between them with a profound and gentle weight. He had said the words. He had shattered the walls of his own prison. "You love me?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "More than I thought I was capable of loving anything again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've been hiding in the dark for 3 years, Annalise. You brought the light back in. He leaned in and kissed her, a gesture of desperate relief and profound certainty. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a promise, a vow made in the wreckage of his home, a pledge to build a new life together from the ruins. The aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos. Sheriff Brody and his men rounded up the injured and fleeing members of Corbin's crew, including Corbin himself, who had been foolishly leading the charge. The house was a wreck, shattered windows, splintered furniture, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. But as the sun began to rise, casting a pale, hopeful light over the valley, it did not feel like a place of defeat. It felt consecrated. Martha Brody arrived soon after, her face a mask of worry that melted into relieved tears when she saw Annalise was safe. She immediately took charge, bustling around, assessing the damage, and tending to the gash on Elias's arm with a practiced hand. Annalise stayed by his side, her presence a quiet, constant comfort. The way her hand rested on his shoulder, the way their eyes met across the room, spoke a language of commitment that everyone present could understand. Later that morning, after the prisoners had been hauled away and the posse had departed, leaving 2 men behind to help with the cleanup, Elias found Annalise on the porch. She was sweeping away broken glass, her movements methodical, as if the simple, domestic act could restore order to their shattered world. He came to stand beside her, watching her for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said softly. "This is my home," she replied without looking up, her voice firm. "I will help to mend it." His heart swelled. He took the broom from her hands, setting it aside. He took her hands in his. They were smudged with dirt and trembling slightly, but they were strong. "Annalise Croft," he began, his voice suddenly feeling too large for his chest. "My house is broken. My life has been a ruin for longer than I care to admit. I have nothing fine to offer you. Only a hard life on a piece of unforgiving land." He paused, gathering his courage. "But I love you, and I cannot imagine another day of this life without you in it. I am asking you to build a new life with me. Here." Out of all this wreckage, he reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. It was worn with age. "This was my grandmother's. It was Sarah's." He saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes and hurried to explain. "It is not meant to replace anyone. It is meant to be a link. To connect the past, I have to honor with the future I want to build. With you." He looked at her, his soul bared. "Will you marry me, Annalise?" Tears streamed freely down her face now, but she was smiling a radiant, beautiful smile that lit up her entire being. "Oh, Elias," she breathed. "I thought you were sending me away, never again," he vowed, his voice thick. "If you'll have me, yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, she was. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, its warmth chasing away the last of the night's chill. The broken glass at their feet glittered like diamonds in the morning light. Their wedding was a simple affair, held a month later on the porch of the newly repaired ranch house. The entire town of Redemption Gulch seemed to be in attendance. The men who had come to see Elias as a remote, untouchable figure now slapped him on the back, their respect for him deepened by the story of the fight at his ranch. The women fussed over Annalise, who wore a simple cream-colored dress that Martha had helped her sew. She had never looked more beautiful. Sheriff Brody officiated, his voice filled with genuine warmth as he spoke the familiar words. When Elias looked at Annalise, he saw not a refined lady from the East, but his partner, his equal, a woman whose strength and courage matched the rugged beauty of the land she had chosen to call home. As he said his vows, he was not just making a promise to her. He was making a promise to himself, to leave the ghosts of the past to rest and to embrace the vibrant, living future that stood before him. The townspeople had helped them rebuild. New window panes were fitted, the splintered door was replaced, and the bullet holes in the walls were patched. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a testament to the resilience of its inhabitants and the support of their community. Elias, who had believed he needed no one, found himself humbled and grateful for the kindness of his neighbors. He was no longer an island. He was part of something larger, a web of connections he had long denied himself. That night, after the last of the guests had departed, leaving behind the pleasant scent of wood smoke and leftover cake, Elias and Annalise stood on the porch, hand in hand, looking out at the star-dusted sky. The house behind them was quiet, filled with a new kind of peace. It was not the sterile silence of absence, but the gentle, breathing quiet of a shared life. "Are you happy, Annalise Thorne?" he asked, the sound of her new name a quiet joy. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I came west seeking a future, Elias. I thought I was looking for security, a home. I did not know I was really looking for you." She turned her face up to his. "I have never been happier, or more certain that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." He lowered his head and kissed her, a long, slow kiss filled with all the promises of the nights to come and the life they would build, day by precious day. 1 year later, the valley was bursting with the vibrant green of a Wyoming spring. The creek ran high and clear with melted snow, and the wildflowers Annalise had planted along the porch steps were a riot of color. The ranch was thriving. The herd had grown, and a new, larger corral stood testament to Elias's hard work and renewed purpose. The house, too, had changed. Curtains, sewn by Annalise, now hung in the windows. A colorful quilt lay draped over the back of a new rocking chair by the fire. It was a home filled with warmth, laughter, and a scent of baking bread and fresh lavender. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, leaning against a post, watching his wife. Annalise was kneeling in her garden, her hands buried in the rich earth. Her honey-blonde hair was tied back in a simple braid, and she wore a practical blue calico dress. She was humming a soft tune, her face serene. Her belly was swollen with the gentle, promising curve of their first child, due in the late summer. The sight of her filled him with a love so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. He walked over to her, his boots silent on the soft grass. He knelt beside her, taking her dirt-smudged hand in his. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She smiled, leaning into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "I was thinking about the day I arrived," she said. "How lost and frightened I was. How this all seemed so harsh and alien." She gestured to the vast landscape around them, the rugged mountains, the endless sky. "I thought I had come to the end of the world, and now," he prompted. "Now I know I came to the beginning of it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "My world, anyway. Our world." She placed his hand on her belly, and he felt the faint, miraculous flutter of the new life within. A son. The doctor had told them it was likely a son, not a replacement for the child he had lost, but a new beginning, a new branch on the family tree he had thought was severed forever. He looked from her radiant face to the two simple wooden crosses on the hill overlooking the house. For the first time, he could look at them without the crushing weight of grief. The pain was still there, a scar on his soul, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a part of his story, the prologue to the life he was living now. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Sarah would have been happy for him. She would have loved the woman who had brought him back to life. "I love you, Annalise Thorne," he said, the words as natural and necessary as breathing. "And I love you, Elias," she replied, her green eyes shining. "Thank you for not sending me away." He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes. "It would appear my world turned upside down the day you stepped out of that stagecoach." He looked out at the horizon, at the land that was his home, at the woman who was his heart, at the future that was growing inside her. "And I wouldn't have it any other way."